All right, welcome back to the History Coach. Today, we're covering units 7 and 8 in AP World History. We're talking about my favorite time period, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And by the end of this unit, you're going to be able to explain causes, consequences, and any AP question that they throw at you on this time period. Part 1, World War I. Let's talk about the causes. I think at this point, we should all know the famous acronym M-A-I-N. M, militarism. A, alliances. I, imperialism. And N, nationalism. But history coach, what does that all mean? Militarism. Countries build massive armies. We'll see Great Britain and Germany, a unified Germany, become involved in a large arms race. Alliances. Europe splits up into teams. I, imperialism. We see in the past unit, European countries scramble for Africa, scramble for Asia. So that was also a motive to continue gaining these natural resources overseas. And last, nationalism. Pride turns very aggressive. Then boom, the spark, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne. But don't fall for it. That didn't cause the war alone. It just lit the fuse in what we know as the powder keg in the Balkans. So when war breaks out throughout Europe, it also pulls in their colonies. We will see, the trench warfare. We will see mustard gas. We will see fighting in World War I that we have never seen on this scale. This war introduces what we know as total war. Economies get pulled into the war. Population, drafts from every country, major country around the world. What are the results? Over 16 million dead. And then comes the Treaty of Versailles. We know that the Treaty of Versailles was a victor's treaty. The victors dictated the means of the outcome of the war. And who gets hit the hardest? Germany. Massive war reparations, close to $1 trillion in today's currency that they'll pay back in 2010. 13% of their land was taken from them. We see they lose their colonies overseas in Africa and Asia. They're forced to be a republic. And the most devastating clause in the Treaty of Versailles handed down on Germany was the war guilt clause, that they were the sole blame for the outbreak of World War I. We also see countries, victor countries, like Italy, who flip-flopped in World War I from the Central Powers to the Allies, and Japan, who gave millions of dollars to the Allied cause, helped clear German colonies in the Pacific. Both countries were victors, but they felt like losers at the treaty. Japan wasn't even spoken to, and that is the ultimate slap in the face. So they walk out. Italy is promised land that they were never given. And then you have the United States, who came late in the war, but Woodrow Wilson was a major player, a major conductor at the Paris peace talks. And what we know he introduced were his 14 points. Now, the rest of Europe said, "Thank you, United States, for bailing us out near the end of the war. But you know what we really like? We don't like the 13 points. We like 1 point, and that was the creation of the League of Nations. Now, as you know, the United States voted not to be in the League of Nations. The majority of the population, our Congress, felt that by being part of this league, it would pull us into future foreign wars. So you can kind of see the creation of the future Axis in World War II. And if the United States would have been part of the League of Nations, who knows if those Axis nations would have been so as aggressive as they were. So this sets the stage for what I like to call the Dark Valley from 1919 to 1939, or better known as the interwar period. So in between the wars, things don't get better, they get worse. Enter the Great Depression. 1929, we see Wall Street crash in the United States. Global economic crisis, massive unemployment. Governments struggle big time. And every nation around the world cannot escape this massive tsunami, which is the Great Depression. And unfortunately, this creates the perfect environment for authoritarian leaders like Benito Mussolini, where we see in 1922, he will perform with his black shirts in Italy the March on Rome. Leaders like Adolf Hitler will perform a similar march on the Bavarian government known as the Beer Hall Push. And don't forget Tojo in Japan. They all promise strength, stability, and national pride. World War II is basically unfinished business from World War I. So the key causes of World War II was the Treaty of Versailles, expansionist aggression, and failure of appeasement. Just a quick example of appeasement: when Hitler threatened to invade the Sudetenland of Western Czechoslovakia, Great Britain, France, but not Czechoslovakia, and Hitler met in Munich to talk about the fate of the Sudeten area. Now, Hitler believed in self-determination. That's what Woodrow Wilson really stressed at the Treaty of Versailles. So when Hitler went into areas early on in the 1930s, he said, well, this is self-determination for German people who had lost their land, now had new land or areas created. So Hitler steps in, meets with leaders of those major countries, and they decide to pretty much give or appease Adolf Hitler and give him Western Czechoslovakia. This was the crisis kind of heard around the world. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, returns back to London and says, we have achieved peace in our time. And then looks and says, oh, they're taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia, Germany. So Hitler looks at him and says, well, yeah, I lied. So that really shows the appeasement process. To make World War II as quick as possible, because I teach that throughout the year as a single subject, let's look at some key features, all right? Blitzkrieg, a lightning tactic taken by the Germans to invade Poland in 1939 that started Hitler's war, and then invade Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France. That's where we see Blitzkrieg between 1939 and about 1941. Now, World War II was not called World War II in 1939. It was called World War II after the Japanese invaded United States Pearl Harbor. They called it Hitler's War. So we see the very first loss for the Germans in Europe at the Battle of Britain. They then have to realize, all right, they could not successfully invade Great Britain, so the Germans turned their sights on the Soviet Union. Yes, they had to break that non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler, but you know what? Hitler needed land, Lebensraum. And we know how that went for Adolf Hitler and the Germans. Yeah, not so well. I don't think Hitler really read history books and said, well, Napoleon couldn't do it. What makes, the Germans think that they could? And the famous Battle of Stalingrad, that was the turning point in World War II in the European campaign. Now, Hitler then had to go on the defensive from then. Meanwhile, around the world, the Axis, Germany, Italy, and Japan, all have ambitions to reconquer territory. They are motivated by nationalism, national pride. They even are basing it off of religious motivation, like in Japan. Okay, in England, they say, God save the king. In Japan, they are going to die for their emperor. So yes, the emperors look like as a living god. Yeah, Italy wants to reconquer the old Roman Empire. So they first go into Ethiopia, then into Abyssinia. Not major countries, but that will begin their imperial conquest. Mr. Line, the history coach, did Hitler start World War II or was it the Japanese? Well, it was the Japanese. They had a presence in China since about 1931 and even before. So when we think of the aggressors, clearly it was Japan in Manchuria and then their major invasion of eastern China. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Yes, the Japanese Empire will invade Pearl Harbor, where the United States Pacific Naval Fleet is located. And I can spend hours on the interesting facts, the tactics. Just know that the Japanese fleet, led by Admiral Yamamoto, traveled over 3,000 nautical miles undetected, all right, to send over 350, with about 4 aircrafters, 350 Japanese Zeros, bombers, you name it, to inflict heavy damage on the American Pacific Fleet. That they did. They sunk over 6 battleships. Aircraft carriers were not present. They did not hit the American fuel storage tanks. So a lot of things went wrong for the Japanese, but they absolutely disabled the American Pacific Fleet for about 6 months. So you would think the Americans would go after Japan first. Well, the Japanese invaded, all right, Pacific Islands, even took over the American Philippines to set up a defensive barrier when the Americans would attack. So the Americans actually had to enter the European campaign first. We had to help out the British so their island would not be sunk by the Germans, because in the future, that will serve as a landing craft when the Americans do arrive. So we enter the Battle of the Atlantic first, and it's going to take us about 6 months to really repair our Pacific Fleet. Now, after the Doolittle raids and the first Battle of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands, the Americans decide to island hop all the way north, hoping to reach Tokyo. And the turning point, don't forget, in the Pacific Campaign will be the famous Battle of Midway, where the Americans already know where the Japanese are going to be, at what time they're going to be. So unlike the intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor, we will see the Americans use intelligence as a massive tool to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and destroy a handful of Japanese planes. So after the famous Battle of Midway, Japan has to go on the defensive. I know I'm going on and on about World War II, which I could, but I just want you to know the key battles. I want you to know why World War I started and ultimately how it ended. In April of 1945, Hitler will be squeezed in on both sides. You have the British, French, and Americans pushing in from the west, and the Soviets will be pushing in from the east. We know the Soviets will reach Berlin first. The Americans, British, and French will head south into southern Germany. With Hitler hiding in the bunker in April of 1945, they understand that the end of the Third Reich is near. The Germans lose the Battle of Berlin. Hitler and Eva Braun, his mistress, all throughout the war, will then commit suicide and ultimately surrender. Better known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. Now, on the other side of the globe, the Americans are island hopping for over 4 years, and they get to their final island known as Okinawa, the bloodiest battle in the Pacific Campaign. So while the Americans are fighting the Japanese on Okinawa, they will witness hundreds of massive suicides. The Japanese are not going to surrender. So that convinced the American High Command that they had to use a tool that they had been in the projects for over 3 years, better known as the Manhattan Project, the creation of 2 atomic weapons. The Americans will use these 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ultimately ending the war, creating VJ Day, victory over Japan. Now, with World War II coming to an end in Europe and in the Pacific, the Americans have to realize that there will be another war that will be emerging. They understand that their ally in World War II, the Soviet Union, will now become their future ideological enemy. Why is that? Well, it was the technology that was created throughout the war with both countries. And most importantly, and a big shock to the world, both countries had access to nuclear weapons. These new superpowers emerge, the United States and the Soviet Union, after World War II. We see the creation of the United Nations. And what World War II did for the United States, it put them on a global scale. I always like to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire, but now after World War II, it doesn't set on the American Empire as well. We will also see the decolonization process. It will heighten. We know after World War I, a lot of these colonies just became mandates. So now the true idea of self-determination should be put into action. When we think of the Cold War, very simple. Think of the United States, capitalism, and democracy. When we think of the Soviet Union, you think of communism. This ultimately leads to many races, such as the arms race, the space race, proxy wars all around the world. Since the world is divided into 2 competing sections. Okay, now, if you remember anything from Unit 7 and Unit 8, it's important to remember these AP world history themes. Wars during this period were ultimately caused by long-term tensions and immediate triggers. Technology made wars more deadly, more devastating. Peace settlements often caused future conflicts. I mean, World War II reshaped the globe. And the Cold War was not a major war between the 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It was more of an ideological war. So if you're into wars, which is interesting, you should love Unit 7 and Unit 8. Thanks for tuning in to the History Coach. See you for Unit 9. We're almost done.